Hey, what's up guys? Alex here with a new video, and today we're doing another comparison between the Sony A7IV and the Canon EOS R6. If you're new to the channel, I am a portrait photographer based out of Orlando, Florida, and a retired wedding photographer. In my previous video, I compared the Sony A7IV and the EOS R6, and if you're curious to check out that comparison, feel free to subscribe to my channel and check out that video. Today, we're building out what I call the ultimate budget kit. What is that? Both manufacturers, both Sony and Canon, offer budget lenses, budget prime specifically, and they have some of the focal lengths I like the most. That's a 35mm, 50mm, and 85mm. So I thought it'd be fun to compare both budget options head to head to see which one offers a better value. When you think about these cameras in the system, usually someone is coming over new, switching over, or starting from scratch. And sometimes people put all their money into their new body and don't save money for lenses. So I think this is a great video for you to see who has the better budget kit. So for this video, we're gonna compare those three lenses. Let's get things started. We're gonna start off by comparing price. And I have my notes here and I'll put some text to kind of go over what the pricing is. What surprised me here is the Canon came out cheaper. Now, Sony does have more options. It's a more mature system. They have third-party lenses, so you could potentially play with different brands to get a cheaper kit, but because we're doing this all first party, here's what it looks like. So if you were to buy a Canon EOS R6 brand new, it's $24.99. The Canon 35 1.8, $499. And the Canon 50 1.8, $199. And the Canon RF 85 f2, $599. Now, all those prices are in American dollars for a grand total of $3,796. If we switch over to the Sony side, you can pick up a Sony A7IV for $24.98, a whole dollar cheaper than the R6. The 35mm 1.8 for $748, that's pricier. The Sony 50 1.8 for $248, and the Sony 85 1.8 for $598 for a grand total of $4,092. So the Canon system comes out around $300 less than the Sony system, and that surprised me. But do you get more value with the Sony system? Let's jump right in and kind of compare these lenses. So we're gonna start off with the 35mm focal length. Okay, kicking things off, we're gonna talk about the 35mm focal length. What's interesting here is the Sony lens is priced at $748. The Canon lens is priced at $499, but the Canon lens provides image stabilization and macro capabilities. So you're getting more for less. Now the Sony has been praised for its image quality and its great video performance. Today we're only looking at photo performance, so we'll really see if it's worth that extra premium because the Canon does have more features. They're both similar size. They both feel good in the hand. The Canon is made out of a plastic. The Sony's made out of a mixture of plastic and aluminum. But let's really get down to the images and see if the Sony's worth that premium price. Let's kick things off. For this comparison, we're only gonna look at raw files, so my edits don't have any influence on the lens performance. Let's take a look at some images. On the left, we have the Sony. On the right, we have the Canon. You're gonna see that they look very, very similar. Zooming in at 100%, you're gonna see that both images here were a little underexposed. Let me see if I can actually bump the exposure on both of them to get a better representation of what we're looking at here. So let me go ahead and just bump the exposure 2 on the Sony. Let's do 2 here on the Canon. And now they are even. Let's go ahead and get out of that. Cool. So I bumped the exposure the same amount on both images. Let's go ahead and zoom in. You're gonna see here that they both look really, really good. The Canon image looks sharper to me off the bat. You can see just way more detail on my wife's face, and it's less megapixels, so that tells me that the lens is sharper. And at 100%, both images look really, really good to me, and I'm not really seeing any difference I would say one is way better than the other. Let's look at another set of images. In this set of images, we have, again, the Sony on the left, Canon on the right. I purposefully shot these images with the sun right on top of my wife's head to see how the lens would handle direct light hitting the lens. And you can see that the Canon did lose some contrast. It looks a little bit more washed out if you look at the right-hand side. Zooming in though, the Canon just is a sharper lens. You can see just way more detail. And one thing that stands out here in this image, you can see in my wife's forehead on the Sony lens, some lens flare action kind of happening that got in my wife's face. The Canon did have lens flare, but it happened to hit on the bottom of the image. You can see this green flare in my wife's pants. The flare is definitely bigger on the Canon, but it's not in my wife's face, so it's definitely manageable. Another thing you're going to notice off the bat, and this is actually quite surprising, and I'm not sure if this is the design of the lens or if I have a bad copy, so if you own this lens, let me know down in the comments below. But the Sony lens has a different focal plane. So what does that mean? If you look at the Canon image, you can see that my wife is sharp in the face, and because her body's in the same focal plane, her body's also sharp. You can see her hands are sharp, you can see all the detail. On the Sony, again, she's standing in the same spot. The focus changes drastically from the face, so now her hands are out of focus, which means there's a curvature to the focal plane, and things are out of focus, just start falling out of focus at a different rate. It's not flat. Again, not sure if it's by design or if I have a bad copy, but here, definitely see it in the image. And I think what you can see from these two images is that the Canon is a sharper lens from the looks of it. The Sony handles contrast better when the light's hitting it directly, but the Sony also has lens flare. Let's look at more images before we start drawing conclusions. In this set of images, again, Sony on the left, Canon on the right. Zooming in, I just think that the Canon lens is sharper, and so far in all three images, it looks sharper to me. In this image, again, you can see how on the Canon, my wife's necklace is still somewhat in focus, or you can see some detail. And on the Sony, it's already out of focus. So that kind of shows you how they're both shot at 1.8 with the same settings, but just a different focal plane. And that's very, very interesting. Overall, looking at the image, you see some green fringing on my wife's bracelet on the Sony, but nothing else really stands out. In these next set of images, I really stress test the lenses with lens flare to see how they would do, and a little bit of the same results we saw earlier. If you look at the Sony on the left, Canon on the right, you can see that the Sony definitely has better contrast with the light hitting it directly. If you zoom in, they both look really good, but you can definitely see that the Canon's a bit more washed out with the light coming in from the side. It also looks a little bit more natural though. So I mean, really kind of up to you on the look. I don't think there's a right or wrong lens here. You can see that the lens flare on the Sony here is on my wife's pants. And on the Canon, it's on the bottom corner here, this green blob. But in this image, I think they both look good. The Sony definitely has better contrast and definitely handles that light flare better. What's interesting is in this next set of images, it gets a little wild. Let's take a look. So here we have the Sony on the left, Canon on the right. You know what? From now on, every image on the left Sony, Canon will be on the right. So I stopped saying that. I'm repeating myself too much. But you're gonna see at the Sony, you have the lens flare really come in from the left-hand side all the way through the right side of the image. It's just wild how large this lens flare is. Versus on the Canon, you have a bigger lens flare blob on the right, but it's kind of just contained there. And when you look at the image from far away, the Canon, I think, produces a better lens flare. It's more manageable, I want to say better. The Sony has a wider lens flare, and yeah, this is going to be preference. They both definitely flare up. I think that the Sony has more contrast again, but tell me what you think down below. It's hard to say who's a winner on the lens flare here, because it's all kind of preference. I like the Canon better personally, but I think it's going to be up to you. And on my last set of images here, these images are backlit, they're contrasty. I really kind of shot it here because I wanted to see how much fringing we would get with these lenses. Looking at my wife, overall, on the Canon, not much fringing. On the Sony, we do have some purple fringing on her arm. It's not crazy, it's easily removable. And from image quality, both look good. I think the Canon's a sharper lens. So with these set of images, I think the conclusion is the Canon's a sharper lens, the Sony's a contrastier lens. And to me, the winner goes to Canon just based on these set of images. We haven't even tested image stabilization. So let's take a look at image stabilization and why it's important to have it on a lens, because here's where you start seeing you get way more value on the Canon, and it's a cheaper lens. So I shot a set of images of my wife at a restaurant. It was dark, and I shot it at 1/5 of a second, so super low. Both cameras do have in-body image stabilization. That's a lot to ask of the camera, 1/5 of a second. I wanted to see how many sharp images I would get. And I'm not even gonna zoom in here. I'm just gonna kind of scroll through images so you can see. Here's the Canon. That looks good. That looks good. That looks good. 3, 4, 5, 6. That one does not look good. 7, 8. Oh, not really. 9, 10, 10 images out of that set. 2 were kind of, you can clearly tell were out of focus, and the 10 were definitely usable and workable just from looking at it. Going to the Sony, nope, maybe, I think so. 1, 2, 3. So about 4 images that were kind of usable. If we were to zoom in, you can see that definitely not all sharp. So image stabilization helps go down all the way to 1/5 of a second to really maximize your ISO and image quality, and it makes a difference. So final conclusions with the 35mm lenses, I like the Canon better. It's cheaper, you have image stabilization, it's sharper, and we didn't even cover this, but it also has macro capabilities. So you get way more for your money, and it's about $300 less. Let me double check because I forgot the pricing. $499 versus $748, $250 less. I think it's a no-brainer here that Canon has a better budget 35mm. But you let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Let's move on. Moving on to the 50mm, or the nifty 50, the plastic fantastic, whatever you want to call it. This is a great focal length, and both systems have a very affordable option. The Canon's $199, the Sony's $248, so $50 more. They're both made out of plastic. They're both incredibly light. They almost feel hollow inside. And looking at these lenses, they definitely feel like budget lenses. The 35mm lenses we just looked at were definitely higher quality. These are smaller, cheaper. You get the point. That's why they call it the plastic fantastic. Looking at the image quality, let's see which one really shines. And the Sony has been kind of criticized for not being the best lens they've put out. And I personally used the Canon before, and I thought it was just okay. But again, we're talking about $200 lenses. So let's compare both of them. Okay. Looking at these images, zooming in, both images actually look really, really good. Again, same settings, just a reminder, Sony on the left, Canon on the right. And overall, initial thoughts here on the first set of images, they both look good. Hard to say one's better than the other. It looks like potentially I might have moved. Potentially the Canon might be a little bit wider, but from this set of images, hard to really say anything. They both did pretty good. Let's go to another set of images. Here again, we have the Sony on the left. Let's go ahead and zoom in. Both images are pretty good. From this image, it looks like the Canon is sharper, and just looking at the details, I mean, you're splitting hairs. It looks maybe a little bit sharper, but they both actually are super comparable. And again, this one's a tough one because they both actually perform very, very similarly. And I can't say one is better than the other so far with these images. Let's move on to a third set of images. Moving on to this third set, this image, you kind of start seeing a little bit of a difference, and I'll point it out. But if you look at sharpness and performance, both lenses are really, really sharp here. I shot these images at 2.8, and it really makes a difference on this lens. When you go down to 2.8, you definitely get sharper results. And I think here they both look really, really good. And when zoomed into the face, when you look at sharpness and contrast, they're almost identical. Where you're gonna see a difference is how it handles the sun behind the image. So the Sony produces this ugly lens flare. It looks like a rainbow blob. Yeah, definitely not nice. And with the Canon, you're almost getting like a sunstar effect here. This is a beautiful lens flare, and you can see in the corner, it looks really, really good on the Canon. On the Sony, you just get a blob. So sharpness, contrast, very, very similar. I think the lens flare here definitely puts the Canon a little bit on the top. So we finally have a small little lead here, and the Canon kind of took the lead on this one. Let's go ahead and look at another set of images where I really stress test the lens flare to see how they perform. And here is where the Sony's gonna get that lead back, because you can see that with a hardcore lens flare behind, the Canon falls apart. So looking at these images, just off the bat, you can see that this lens flare on the Canon is getting in my wife's face, and it's just way overpowering. And the Sony surprisingly maintains a great contrast and great sharpness. Now, Again, these images were shot at 2.8. Really impressed here with the Sony, and also not seeing any purple or green fringing on these images, which are very kind of high contrast here. And overall, like the Sony here really looks really good for a budget lens and really handles that flare really well. And zooming in on the Canon, just looking at it, just again, you get that haze. It fell apart here with this lens flare. Let's look at a final set of images and really kind of declare a winner on the 50mm focal length. Looking at these images, they look identical. Zooming in, they both look really good. Not really spotting anything that stands out, sticks out. Even in the background, bokeh's close to the same. Guys, this is a tough one. In one set of images, the Canon handled the lens flare a little bit better. When it was put to a stress test with lens flares, the Sony just handled it a lot better contrast. But in everyday use, sharpness, contrast, these are almost identical. It's hard to declare a winner. If I have to declare a winner, just because of the extreme stress test with a lens flare, I have to say the Sony, but we're talking about like marginal here. These lenses are practically identical and you can't go wrong with either or. At $200 or $250, they're great options. I mean, when you factor in the price, like this is a toss up. I'll let you guys pick. For me, I'm kind of neutral. I want to declare this one a tie because they're so close. I'm going to declare this one a tie. You let me know down in the comments below. And let's wrap up with the 85mm focal length. Okay, so the 85mm lenses are very similar to the 35mm, where I think they're a little bit higher quality than the 50mm range. The Canon comes in at $599 and the Sony comes in at $598. So we're talking about $1 difference here between the Canon and the Sony. The Canon though has macro capabilities and IS, but it's a 2.0 lens versus a 1.8 lens on the Sony. You're getting more features on the Canon here because, you know, image stabilization is a great feature, and having macro makes it even a better feature because you can have a multi-purpose lens. So let's see how they perform and to see if there's any big differences and see if that extra dollar really kind of comes in handy. But let's compare a set of images here. Sony on the left, Canon on the right, per usual. Zooming in, you're gonna see here that the Sony was shot at 1.8, Canon was shot at 2.0, which means we're going to get a little bit of a darker image. But looking at these images, they both look really good. They're both sharp. They both have contrast. Not seeing any fringing. Both these images look really good. The bokeh in the background looks very similar. Let's move on to another set of images. It's hard to see a difference here. Okay, this is one of my favorite images of the shoot. I love this picture of my wife. Zooming in here, just look at that. These are, I think, the highest performing lenses out of all of them. The contrast, the sharpness, I mean, this is great. You can see it with the Sony, you have a faster fall off. You can see my wife's ears already getting out of focus. And on the Canon, you still have a bigger depth of field because it's a 2.0 lens. Looking at these images, they both look really good. And I love this portrait. This is great. Let's move on to another image. For this image, again, looking at them, zooming in, they're both sharp. Both have great contrast. Even the background blur looks very similar. You have a creamier background with the Sony. That 1.8 to 2.0 makes a small difference, but it definitely makes a difference. You can see it, but image quality on these lenses is just, it's great. It's hard to think these are budget lenses. These 85mm are just doing outstanding. Let's look at another set of images. Here's where we do the lens flare stress test. And here is where the Canon takes a lead because you look at these images, you zoom in, both contrasty, they both are sharp. As a matter of fact, when you're looking at just the subject, which is my wife, both images look almost identical. But you're gonna see here on the Sony, you start getting this massive lens flare on the left-hand corner. And on the Canon, it handles the light so good. Like there is no flare whatsoever on this image. It's a contrasty image, and here, this is the best performing Canon lens with lens flare when you look at the 35 and the 50, but here's where the Canon definitely takes the lead. Looking at this other image, zooming in, like, I don't know what y'all want me to say. Like at this point, these lenses are practically identical. They both are sharp, they both look good. And a reminder, I'm providing the raw files for you to download and play with yourself, because this comparison's a lot closer than I expected. And for the final image, zooming in here at my wife, don't know what to say. Sharp, contrasty, they both look really good. If I'm nitpicking here, because I have to, the Canon shows some lens flare here on this piece of wood, and the Sony does not. So who's the winner? I mean, image quality, they're practically identical. When you look at a feature set, you get image stabilization and macro with a Canon. And for that extra dollar, like, I think that puts it on top for me. From image quality perspective, they're a tie. Let's wrap this video up. Okay, that was a long comparison, but we looked at 3 different focal lengths. And what was interesting is I wasn't expecting this going into this test. I wasn't expecting to have such similarities between these lenses because they're from different manufacturers. But the reality is they're more similar than you expect. And when you look at the results, all these lenses can deliver great image quality and great results. So it's hard to say one is a definitive winner over the other. The reality is one's more expensive than the other. And it's ironic because the Sony system usually has more affordable options. In this situation, it's more expensive. And the reality is when you look at these 2 kits collectively as a whole, you get better value with the Canon because you're getting a cheaper kit. You're getting image stabilization with a 35mm and the 85mm. You're also getting macro capabilities with a 35 and the 85, and those features are great. If you're in the wedding industry, having that macro feature on the 85 really eliminates the need to have a dedicated macro lens, which means it saves you more money. And the image quality of that lens is really, really good. So again, I can't stress this enough. Both these kits will be great in the hands of a skilled photographer. If you have these lenses or these cameras and you can make a good image, it's not the equipment, it's you. I'm sorry to say that. But when you're looking at value, the Canon definitely wins here. What are your thoughts? Like I said, and I mentioned twice, I'm including raw files down below. Download them, play with them, let me know in the comments. This has really been an eye-opening experience for me because of how similar these lenses have been. And as I do more comparisons with Sony and Canon, I have a feeling that line and the similarities is just gonna be neck to neck as we kind of go on to the higher end lenses. As always, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. This is one of the longest videos I've ever made. So if you stuck this long, please give me a like, please give me a subscribe. And as always, I will see you on the next one. Have a good one, guys. Peace.